The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1. Titus Groan. While the Old Nurse Dozes. For the time being, Steerpike must be left at the Prune Squalors, where in the somewhat elastic capacity of odd-job man, medical assistant, lady's help and conversationalist, he managed to wedge himself firmly into the structure of the household. His ingratiating manner had, day by day, a more assiduous effect, until he was looked upon as part of the ménage, being an alien only with the cook, who, as an old retainer, felt no love for an upstart and treated him with undisguised suspicion. The doctor found him extremely quick to learn, and within a few weeks Steerpike was in control of all the dispensary work. Indeed, the chemicals and drugs had a strong fascination for the youth, and he would often be found compiling mixtures of his own invention. Of the compromising and tragic circumstances that were the outcome of all this is not yet time to speak. Within the castle the time-honoured rituals were performed daily. The excitement following upon the birth of Titus had in some degree subsided. The Countess, against the warnings of her medical adviser, was, as she had declared she would be, up and about. She was, it is true, very weak at first, but so violent was her irritation at not being able to greet the dawn as was her habit, accompanied by a white tide of cats, that she defied the lassitude of her body. She had heard the cats crying to her from the lawn 60 feet below her room as she lay in bed those 3 mornings after little Titus had been delivered, and lying there hugely in her candle-lit room, she had yearned to be with them, and beads of sweat had stood out upon her skin as in her agony she hankered for strength. Had not her birds been with her, the frustration of her spirit must surely have done her more than the physical harm of getting up. The constantly changing population of her feathered children were the solace of those few days that seemed to her like months. The white rook was the most constant in his appearances at the ivy-choked window, although up to the moment of her confinement he had been the most fickle of visitors. In her deep voice she would hold converse with him for an hour at a time, referring to him as Master Chalk or her Wicked One. All her companions came. Sometimes the room was alive with song. Sometimes, feeling the need to exercise their pinions in the sky, a crowd of them would follow one another through the window of ivy, around which, in the shadowy air as they waited their turn to scramble through, a dozen birds at a time would hover, fall, and rise, rattling their many-coloured wings. Thus it might be that from time to time she would be almost deserted. On one occasion only a stone chat and a bedraggled owl were with her. Now she was strong enough to walk and watch them circling in the sky, or to sit in her arbour at the end of the long lawn, and with the sunlight smouldering the dark, red hair and lying wanly over the area of her face and neck, watch the multiform and snow-white convolutions of her mulkins. Mrs. Slagg had found herself becoming more and more dependent upon Keda's help. She did not like to admit this to herself. There was something so still about Keda which she could not understand. Every now and again she made an effort to impress the girl with an authority which she did not possess, keeping on the alert to try and find some fault in her. This was so obvious and pathetic that it did not annoy the girl from the mud dwellings. She knew that an hour or so afterwards, when Mrs. Slagg felt that her position was once again established, the old nurse would run up to her, nearly in tears for some petty reason or another, and bury her shaking head in Keda's side. Fond as Keda had become to Titus, whom she had suckled and cared for tenderly, she had begun to realize that she must return to the mud dwellings. She had left them suddenly as a being who, feeling that Providence had called him, leaves the old life suddenly for the new. But now she realized that she had made a mistake, and knew she would be false to remain any longer in the castle than was necessary for the child. Not so much a mistake as a crime against her conscience, for it was with a very real reason that she had accompanied Mrs. Slagg at such short notice. Day after day, from the window in the small room she had been given next to Mrs. Slagg's, she gazed to where the high surrounding wall of the castle grounds hid from her sight the dwellings that she had known since her infancy, and where, during the last year, her passions had been so cruelly stirred. Her baby, whom she had buried so recently, had been the son of an old carver of matchless reputation among the dwellers. The marriage had been forced upon her by the iron laws. Those sculptors who were unanimously classed as preeminent were, after the 50th year, allowed to choose a bride from among the damsels, and against their choice no shadow of objection could be raised. This immemorial custom had left Keda no option but to become the wife of this man, who, though a sour and uncouth old creature, burned with a vitality that defied his years. From the morning until the light failed him he would be with his carvings. He would peer at it from all angles, or crouch grotesquely at some distance, his eyes narrowed in the sunlight. Then, stealing up upon it, it would seem that he was preparing to strike like a beast attacking its paralyzed quarry, but on reaching the wooden form he would run his great hand over the surface as a lover will fondle the breasts of his mistress. Within 3 months from the time when he and Keda had performed the marriage ceremony, standing alone upon the marriage hill, to the south of the twisted woods, while an ancient voice called to them through the half-lit distances, their hands joined, her feet upon his. Within the 3 months that followed, he had died. Suddenly, letting the chisel and the hammer fall to the ground, his hands had clutched at his heart, his lips had drawn themselves away from his teeth, and he had crumpled up, his energy passing out of him and leaving only the old dry sack of his body. Keda was alone. She had not loved him but had admired him, and the passion that consumed him as an artist. Once more she was free, save that, on the day that he died, she felt within her the movements of another life than her own, and now, nearly a year later, her firstborn was lying near the father, lifeless, in the dry earth. The dreadful and premature age that descended so suddenly upon the faces of the dwellers had not yet completely fallen over her features. It was as though it was so close upon her that the beauty of her face cried out against it, defying it, as a stag at bay turns upon the hounds with a pride of stance and a shaking of antlers. A hectic beauty came upon the maidens of the mud buildings a month or so before the ravages to which they were predestined attacked them. From infancy until this tragic interim of beauty their loveliness was of a strange innocence, a crystal-like tranquillity that held no prescience of the future. When in this clearness the dark seeds began to root and smoke was mixed with the flame, then, as with Keda now, a thorny splendour struck outwards from their features. One warm afternoon, sitting in Mrs. Slagg's room with Titus at her breast, she turned to the old nurse and said quietly, "At the end of the month I shall return to my home. Titus is strong and well, and he will be able to do without me." Nanny, whose head had been nodding a little, for she was always either dropping off for a nap or waking up from one, opened her eyes when Keda's words had soaked into her brain. Then she sat up very suddenly and in a frightened voice called out, "No, no, you mustn't go, you mustn't! You mustn't! Oh, Keda, you know how old I am." And she ran across the room to hold Keda's arm. Then, for the sake of her dignity, "I've told you not to call him Titus," she cried in a rush. "Lord Titus, or his lordship is what you should say." And then, as though with relief, she fell back upon her trouble. "Oh, you can't go. You can't go." "I must go," said Keda. "There are reasons why I must go." "Why? Why?" Nanny cried out through the tears that were beginning to run jerkily down her foolish, wrinkled face. "Why must you go?" Then she stamped a tiny slippered foot that made very little noise. "You must answer me, you must! Why are you going away from me?" Then, clenching her hands, "I'll tell the Countess," she said. "I'll tell her." Keda took no notice at all, but lifted Titus from one shoulder to another where his crying ceased. "He will be safe in your care," said Keda. "You must find another helper when he grows older, for he will be too much for you." "But they won't be like you," shrilled Nanny Slag, as though she were abusing Keda for her suitability. "They won't be like you. They'll bully me. Some of them bully old women when they are like me. Oh, my weak heart. Oh, my poor weak heart. What can I do?" "Come," said Keda. "It is not as difficult as that." "It is! It is!" cried Mrs. Slag, renewing her authority. "It's worse than that. Oh, much worse. Everyone deserts me because I'm old. You must find someone you can trust. I will try and help you, said Keda. Will you? Will you? Cried Nanny, bringing her fingers up to her mouth and staring at Keda through the red rims of her eyelids. Oh, will you? They make me do everything. Fuchsia's mother leaves everything to me. She has hardly seen his little lordship, has she? Has she? No, said Keda, not once. But he is happy. She lifted the infant away from her and laid him between the blankets in his cot, where after a spell of whimpering he sucked contentedly at his fist. Nanny Slag suddenly gripped Keda's arm again. You haven't told me why. You haven't told me why, she said. I want to know why you're going away from me. You never tell me anything, never. I suppose I'm not worth telling. I suppose you think I don't matter. Why don't you tell me things? Oh, my poor heart, I suppose I'm too old to be told anything. I will tell you why I have to go, said Keda. Sit down and listen. Nanny sat upon a low chair and clapped her wrinkled hands together. Tell me everything, she said. Why Keda broke the long silence that was so much a part of her nature she could not afterwards imagine, feeling only that in talking to one who would hardly understand her, she was virtually talking to herself. There had come to her a sense of relief in unburdening her heart. Keda sat upon Mrs. Slag's bed near the wall. She sat very upright, and her hands lay in her lap. For a moment or two she gazed out of the window at a cloud that had meandered lazily into view. Then she turned to the old woman. When I returned to you on that first evening, said Keda quietly, I was troubled. I was troubled, and am still unhappy because of love. I feared my future, and my past was sorrow, and in my present you had need of me and I had need of refuge, so I came. She paused. 2 men from our mud dwellings loved me. They loved me too much and too violently. Her eyes returned to Nanny Slag, but they hardly saw her, or noticed that her withered lips were pursed and her head tilted like a sparrow's. She continued quietly. My husband had died. He was a bright carver, and died struggling. I would sit down in the long shadows by our dwelling and watch a dryad's head from day to day, finding its hidden outline. To me it seemed he carved the child of leaves. He would not rest, but fight, and stare. And stare. Always he would stare, cutting the wood away to give his dryad breath. One evening when I felt my unborn moving within me, my husband's heart stopped beating and his weapons fell. I ran to him and knelt beside his body. His chisel lay in the dust. Above us his unfinished dryad gazed over the twisted woods, an acorn between its teeth. They buried him, my rough husband, in the long sandy valley, the valley of graves where we are always buried. The 2 dark men who loved and love me carried his body for me, and they lowered it into the sandy hollow that they had scooped. 100 men were there and 100 women, for he had been the rarest of the carvers. The sand was heaped upon him, and there was only another dusty mound among the mounds of the valley, and all was very silent. They held me in their eyes while he was buried, the 2 who loved me. And I could not think of him whom we were mourning. I could not think of death, only of life. I could not think of stillness, only of movement. I could not understand the burying, nor that life could cease to be. It was all a dream. I was alive, and 2 men watched me standing. They stood beyond the grave on the other side. I saw only their shadows, for I dared not lift up my eyes to show my gladness. But I knew that they were watching me, and I knew that I was young. They were strong men, their faces still unbroken by the cruel bane we suffer. They were strong and young. Yet while my husband lived I had not seen them. Though one brought white flowers from the twisted woods and one a dim stone from the Gorman mountain, yet I saw nothing of them, for I knew temptation. That was long ago. All is changed. My baby has been buried and my lovers are filled with hatred for one another. When you came for me I was in torment. From day to day their jealousy had grown until, to save the shedding of blood, I came to the castle. Oh, long ago with you, that dreadful night. She stopped and moved a lock of hair back from her forehead. She did not look at Mrs. Slag, who blinked her eyes as Keda paused and nodded her head wisely. Where are they now? How many, many times I have dreamt of them. How many, many times have I into my pillow cried, Rantel, whom I first saw gathering the root, his coarse hair in his eyes, cried Bregan, who stood brooding in the grove. Yet not with all of me am I in love. Too much of my own quietness is with me. I am not drowned with them in love's unkindness. I am unable to do aught but watch them, and fear them and the hunger in their eyes. The rapture that possesses me by the grave has passed. I am tired now, with a love I do not quite possess. Tired with the hatreds I have woken. Tired that I have the cause and have no power. My beauty will soon leave me. Soon, soon, and peace will come. But too soon. Keda raised her hand and wiped away the slow tears from her cheeks. I must have love, she whispered. Startled at her own outburst, she stood up beside the bed rigidly. Then her eyes turned to the nurse. Keda had been so much alone in her reverie that it seemed natural to her to find that the old woman was asleep. She moved to the window. The afternoon light lay over the towers. In the straggling ivy beneath her, a bird rustled. From far below, a voice cried faintly to some unseen figure, and stillness settled again. She breathed deeply and leaned forward into the light. Her hands grasped the frame of the window on her either side, and her eyes from wandering across the towers were drawn inexorably to that high, encircling wall that hid from her the houses of her people, her childhood, and the substance of her passion.